Hey everyone, hi, welcome or welcome back to my channel. Today I am going to be talking about what I am predicting for the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2023. Now, I have actually created a formula because I think that the Women's Prize is a little bit formulaic. I am going to tell you about my formula, evidence from past years that got me to this conclusion, and then a bunch of wish list books, like specific titles that I think will be on the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2024. Well, if you are new here, then hi, welcome. I'm Shelly, and I really love books and reading of all kinds. And I can't believe that I actually made a slideshow for this. It's very exciting over here. Exciting things are happening. If you like to read or you just like to listen to someone and excitedly talk about her reading, then I would encourage you to subscribe. It really means a lot to me. Like the video if you like the video. I also have a Patreon that you can support me on over there. And without any further rambling on, let's go ahead and get into the meat of this video. The Women's Prize for Fiction is a UK-based prize, and eligibility guidelines really can get you into the weeds if you're into details and specifics. But here's the basics from what I know. The book has to be written by a woman in English, so no translations. It has to be a full-length novel, so no novellas or short story collections. It has to be published in the UK from the dates of April 1st, 2023 and March 31st, 2024. There's a lot of submission guidelines, and I'm sure I'm missing a whole bunch of details in terms of eligibility. But for me, that's the long short of it. I started following the prize in 2022 very, very closely, partly because of a YouTube channel that I have, this channel that you're actually watching, and I had to articulate some of my thoughts about the Women's Prize. Whereas before 2022, I followed it rather loosely. Maybe I would check out the winner or I would notice the shortlist, but I didn't have to articulate thoughts that other people might be watching. And so it was really kind of a low-level, low-key thing for me. I continued to follow the prize. I'm going to go back one second. In 2022, I read the most books I've ever read from any kind of long list on the Women's Prize for Fiction long list in 2022. I read so many of those books. Not all of them, but quite the handful. And then in 2023, I decided to pare way back. And I only read 2 books from the long list. The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell, and then the winner, the one that actually happened to be the winner, Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. And I enjoyed following the prize, but without letting it take over my reading. And from the 2 years that I've been following the prize with some vigor and interest, I've noticed that it seems like there is a formula. And here's what I figured out it is. So there are 2 to 3 big name authors. These are authors that are recognizable. Of course, it's going to be subjective as to like who you follow as an author and who you would consider well established or, you know, has a large back catalog that has been well read, you know, by the public or by the population of readers that they're targeting. There tends to be one Booker overlap, meaning that a book that was nominated for the long list from the previous year for the Booker, it happens to show up on the Women's Prize long list. There's always one overlapping book, it seems. There are 2 to 5, let me see if I can get that right, anywhere between 2 to 5 previously shortlisted or longlisted authors. Authors that the prize has honored before. There are also anywhere between 5 to 9 debut authors. It has a range, but 5 to 9 seems to be what they like to stick around. There's also 2 to 5, or about 2 to 5 books set outside of the US and outside of the EU combined. So most of the books set or take place in the US and the EU, but they always have some books, whether it be 2 all the way up to 5 or maybe even more, that are set outside of those countries, borders. And then there's always going to be a mix of genres. They never have a long list that is fully literary fiction or fully historical fiction or fully leans into magical realism. They're really good. The long list is really good about choosing books from a total mix of genres. So here, let me get into the evidence. We'll start with the last year, the one that's most fresh in my mind, in 2023. Let's take a deeper look into 2023. So here's a photo of the long list to refresh my memory as well as yours. There were 2 big names that I could identify, people that I definitely knew their names and some of their back catalog. That is Maggie O'Farrell and Barbara Kingsolver. Maggie O'Farrell's The Marriage Portrait made the long list, and Demon Copperhead actually won. The Booker overlap this year, which was surprising because I had completely forgotten that it was on the Booker's long list, and it was Glory by No Violet Balawayu. I feel like I'm saying that wrong. There were 5 previously shortlisted authors, and those authors were Maggie O'Farrell, Natalie Haynes, Barbara Kingsolver, Laylene Paul, and Elizabeth Mackenzie. From what I know about submission guidelines, I know that each publisher only has a limited amount of submissions that they can send in to the prize. However, if they have an author that they've published a new book from, and that author has already been honored by the Women's Prize, their book can go in without it counting against the limited amount of submissions the publisher has. So it's kind of like an extra, I don't know, an extra free gift, almost like gift with purchase or something like that. That is a terrible analogy. There was a huge amount of debut authors. Actually, the majority of the long list was made up of debut authors. Last year, there was 9 in total. And as you can see with my slide, I put them all up there. I don't want to go through all of them with you, but it was an astounding number of debut authors, which on the one hand was super cool, and on the other hand, kind of threw all of us readers for a loop. For some of us, a more surprising and exciting loop, and for others, I was kind of, at least me, I can speak for me, I was kind of like, what is this? I haven't heard of any of these authors. But a really fun moment that sticks out to me from last year's list. There were 5 books set outside the EU and the US, and they were Fire Rush by Jacqueline Crooks, set in Jamaica, Black Butterflies by Priscilla Morris, set in Bosnia, Wandering Souls by Cecilia Penn, partially set in Vietnam, The Bandit Queens by Parini Sharaf, set in India, and Glory by No Violet Bulawayu, set in Zimbabwe. Of course, we all see a huge mix of genres. I just pulled some of the more unique choices from the prize. Like The Marriage Portrait is historical fiction. The Dog of the North is a humorous book. Homesick by Jennifer Croft is a semi-autobiographical work. Stoneblind is a mythological retelling, and I'm a Fan was an experimental work. The deeper you look at the list, the more you look at it, the more, at least I have come to realize how much the Women's Prize prioritizes a mix of genres. It could be anything from fantasy to experimental to just weird historical fiction to humorous books or, murder mysteries. They really don't have a limit to what they choose. So it's like anything is on the table in terms of genre, which is kind of cool. Moving on to 2022, here is a picture of the long list, again, for both you and me. The further back you go with the prize, the more I make presumptions, because I have not been following the prize with intense vigor and I have to do some guesswork. So in terms of big names, I identified 3, and it was Louise Erdrich, Elif Shafak, and Ruth Ozeki. 3 authors that I feel like had pretty astounding careers even before they were honored by this year's list. The Booker overlap I remember vividly because I felt like nobody had predicted it. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about that. But it was Maggie Shipstead's The Great Circle, which is a dual timeline. I ended up reading this. I actually read quite a few of these, which was a dual timeline historical fiction, present day book, and it was really good characterization. It had made the Booker's long list and maybe even short list. And I feel like everybody was surprised that it made it onto the Women's Prize long list because it had been not forgotten about, but I think not really thought about much since the Booker had ended. There were 5 previously long-listed authors, and that would be Leon Ross, Catherine Chidgey, Elif Shafak, Charlotte Mendelson, and Rachel Elliott. We go from 9 debut authors to 5 debut authors, which is still quite a great portion of the list. And we have Careless by Christy Capes, The Paper Palace by Miranda Cowley Heller, Build Your House Around My Body. Build My Body Around Your House is what I was going to say. by Violet Coopersmith. The Bread the Devil Need by Lisa Allen Agostini, and The Final Revival of Opal and Nev by Donnie Walton. This year, I identified 3 books that were set outside the EU and the US. Remote Sympathy by Catherine Chidgey was set in Germany. Build Your House Around My Body. I'm going to get that wrong every time. by Violet Coopersmith. That book was set in Vietnam. And The Bread the Devil Need by Lisa Allen Agostini was set in Trinidad. And of course, again, with the mix of genres, you can see there were historical fiction picks, domestic dramas, or even I think they called it a domestic noir, which is The Bread the Devil Need, dark comedies, dystopians, and fantasy. Those were just the genres that stuck out to me. 2021, I had the most guesswork or like presumptional work because I just am not as familiar with this list as I am with the previous 2. But here's the long list, just to refresh everyone's memories. The big names this year, and I will say that one of them is more of a big book, like it was a huge book for the year, rather than a big established author. I felt like this book made the author's career, and that is Britt Bennett's The Vanishing Half. I feel like even before it made the long list for the Women's Prize, I mean, it was being picked for every celebrity book club. Everybody was reading it. It was just taking off quite well on its own. So it was more of a big named book for that year rather than the author being very well established, like the counterpart for my big names in this slide, which is Allie Smith. Allie Smith, she has a career of her own. She has fans, a huge fan base, people who will read pretty much anything she puts out. And this year, Summer made the long list. And so, you know, in contrast to Britt Bennett, I feel like Britt Bennett wrote the book that everybody wanted to read that year versus having a really strong fan base, devoted fans, people who just love her body of work like Allie Smith. The Booker overlap was Burnt Sugar by Avni Dashi. I tell you, there's one every year. And I have one for this year. I'm sure you all can actually probably guess it. If you follow the Booker and you know about the Women's Prize, you could probably guess my Booker overlap. The previously long listed authors is actually a much smaller list this year that I could tell. And it is Summer by Allie Smith. She was previously honored by the Women's Prize, and Amanda Craig with her book Golden Rule. She had made the long list some years back, like in 2010. In 2021, I'm trying to get my years straight. We had 6 debut authors, which again is just an astounding number. Considering that there's 16 books on the long list, it's just a huge number of debuts to include. You know, versus maybe the Booker or even like the Pulitzer. I know the Pulitzer, we only have, with us, that American award, we only honor 3 books. 1 is the winner and 2 are the runners-up typically. Or like, I forget what they call it, but basically the runners-up. And oftentimes we don't see that many debut authors. I mean, I know there's only 3, but percentage-wise, I feel like the Women's Prize is so good about including new authors, new and unknown authors, to bring those authors forward into the public consciousness. 2 books were actually set outside the EU and the US. The first one is How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps My House by Sherry Jones, and that was set in Barbados, and Burnt Sugar by Avni Dashi, which is set in India. And again, I just pulled some of the more unique genres. In 2021, I don't know if it's distance or because I didn't read a ton of books, or if I don't think I've read any. Oh no, I read The Winner. Piranesi was the winner, and I read that, but I have not read anything else from this year. And so to me, it seemed like there were less books set, just from my own observations, but also I'm not as familiar with these books is what I'm trying to say. But there were only 2 books set outside of the EU and the US, and in like later years there are several more. So I'm wondering if they're trending in that direction of having more books set outside the EU and the US. There were also more literary picks, like straight up literary fiction in 2021 versus the other years that seemed like there was just a more intense variety. The variety was far more expansive and was even more genrefied, like it was straight up a fantasy book. But for me, in this year, there was just, in 2021 at least, and I didn't go back to look more, it takes a long time to do these breakdowns. And so it was kind of interesting because it seems like there was more just straight up literary fiction, like set in the US and the UK, and that was it. Even the historical fiction that I included on the mix of genres was set in the 1950s, so it wasn't like set in, 1812 or 1655 or 1311. It was really kind of a relatively recent historical fiction, or with a time period of people who are still living. So anyways, but this year we had a warm/funny pick, a mystery, a family saga, and a fantasy, Piranesi, which actually won. My predictions are definitely a wish list. I feel like you could predict and predict and predict and still be surprised. But my actual predictions are the formula that I laid out before you, my ranges and my categories. I really think that the long list is going to reflect that formula. But here right now are titles that excite me. So the big names that I think are going to make it is actually Ann Patchett and her latest book, Tom Lake. I just think it's been a while since she's been on the long list. This book has been well received, and I wouldn't be surprised if she made it this year, it's just her year. I also think that Emma Donoghue might make it with her book Learned by Heart. I read this a couple months ago, and I really liked it. It talks about Anne Lister and one of Anne Lister's lovers in boarding school, and it was a really interesting book. Now, if I am correct, and please correct me if I am wrong, but I don't think that Emma Donoghue has ever made it to the Women's Prize long list. And that shocks me because Emma Donoghue has had a profound and very successful career. And so it just surprises me that she hasn't been honored yet by this prize. Again, please correct me gently if I am wrong. The Booker overlap that I think will make it is actually Chetna Maru, her book Western Lane. I just think it is, I don't know, it just, to me, kind of strikes that kind of note. It's a debut author. It's talking about squash and grief, squash the game and grief, and it's about 2 sisters. And I just think it's a book that it sort of speaks to me as women's prize darling, but I guess we'll see. Previously long-listed authors, I only had one choice, and it was Ann Patchett. I struggled so mightily to figure out who I wanted to put on this list. You could put Zadie Smith's The Fraud, but I don't, it's not on my wish list. I read that book and I did not like it. And there are several others out there, but people that I would just sort of be making blind guesses and not books that I'm actually interested in. So I just stuck with one, even though I am predicting that there will probably be far more than one previously honored author in this section when the actual long list comes out. My debut authors wish list. I only have 4 on here. I wouldn't be surprised if we see way more debuts on the actual long list. But it is again going to be Titna Maru, Western Lane. There's also this book called Disturbance by Jenna Clark. It is supposed to be for fans of Boy Parts by Eliza Clark. Disturbing, kind of weird, sacrosanct type of novel that I think would be perfect for the Women's Prize. I chose a small town novel set in rural Maine in the 1990s with a cast of relatable characters, and it is called The Road to Dalton by Shanna Bowring. The final book that I chose is by this author named Fatin Abbas, and her book Ghost Season, which is set in the Sudan, and it's supposed to be a political, social, and ecological novel that is set in the heart of Sudan's chaos, and there is kind of a large cast of characters, and she writes about all of them with brilliance, complexity, and empathy. In regards to books set outside the US and the UK, I again put Ghost Season because it's set in Sudan. There's also this book called The Glutton by A.K. Blakemore, which is supposed to be super weird, akin to Perfume by Patrick Suskind, that kind of blends magical realism and fairy tale into a lyrical novel about a glutton living in 18th century France, and sort of all that glutton consumes, which sounds like it's more than just food. On more of the lighter side, it's going to be Sally Braden's Italian Adventure by Christina Lynch. Now, this novel is set during World War II, and it has big-hearted, sort of over-the-top characters going on outlandish adventures, and I could see this being, of course, set in Italy, and I could see this being the like lighthearted pick that we've seen with like The Dog of the North. And then I just have some wish list additions. The first up being Terrace Story by Hilary Leacher, which I think has a bit of magical realism in it, but is essentially about a single terrace in an apartment building, and the whole story moves outward from there, and it actually is bigger and more emotionally affecting than one would imagine, or that one, it's sort of an understated novel that ends up sticking with you. That's what I'm trying to say. I also own it, like I own it, so it helps. Also on my wish list additions, I have Sigrid Nunes's The Vulnerables, which explores a solitary female narrator questioning what it means to be alive in the moment that she is living in. It sounds reflective and thought-provoking. I'm probably going to sum this next book up pretty terribly, but it's a global work. It takes place all over the world, and it is Mobility by Lydia Kiesling. And this is both a story about a woman and her personal life, but also her career, which sounds like it gets into the nitty-gritty of her career, which is supposed to be super interesting. I cannot talk about it with any elegance, but I will say that it did make my list because it piqued my interest. My sweet baby Harry is gonna help me finish out the video, and so are the yard guys, because they have started doing yard work, which means that it is perfect timing because I have to go. But what I was saying is my last choice is The Princess by Wendy Holden. I've heard great things about Wendy Holden's historical fiction, and this is a retelling of Princess Diana. And I think we are overdue, maybe not, but we're overdue for a really good Princess Diana retelling. And I think it would be a crowd pleaser, to be honest with you. Okay, that's it. Tell me what your predictions are. What do you think about my formula? And what do you make of it? Do you want to add to the formula? Is there something that you would take away? I would love to know all of your women's prize thoughts down below. And that's it for me. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And I will see you all in my next one. Bye.